Before the world knew of Rome's Caesars or England's crowns, African kings ruled under the divine gaze of gods and ancestors. Their authority wasn't just political, it was spiritual. In Kemet, ancient Egypt, the pharaoh was Horus in the flesh. In Kush, the Kandake queens and black kings consulted oracles before battle. Across the continent, from the Oyo Empire to the Ashanti Kingdom, leaders weren't merely chosen, they were anointed. Royal power was seen as a sacred duty passed through ancestral lines, guided by spiritual insight and divination. Each coronation was a cosmic event, rituals binding heaven to earth. The Igbo people of Nigeria practiced a decentralized spiritual democracy, where the gods and ancestors were consulted through priests and diviners. Their society revered the Chi, a personal god assigned to each soul. Among the Akan of Ghana, the king was the living stool of the ancestors, and his authority was legitimized only through sacred rites. In Ethiopia, the Solomonic dynasty claimed direct descent from King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, a fusion of Abrahamic myth and African royalty. This sacred genealogy gave rulers divine right beyond human questioning. These systems created more than power structures, they formed entire cosmologies. Governance was not separate from spirituality. In fact, breaking tradition was seen as provoking cosmic disorder. When kings failed to uphold their ancestral mandate, droughts, disease, and war were interpreted as divine punishment. Harmony had to be restored through sacrifice, ritual, or, in extreme cases, dethronement. This spiritual accountability embedded moral checks into African political life long before democracy became a buzzword in the West. Such reverence for the divine produced a unique cultural continuity. Shrines, festivals, and oral traditions preserved the memory of both gods and rulers. The Yoruba still invoke Shango, the thunder god and deified king, during ceremonies. The Dogon people charted stars with astronomical accuracy, based on revelations from their spiritual beings. In African thought, the visible world was only half the story, power came from mastering both the seen and unseen realms. In this sacred beginning, we find not only kings and queens, but celestial diplomats. Rulers who interpreted the will of the gods and anchored their empires in cosmic law. This was the divine root from which Africa's golden civilizations would grow, and eventually, tragically, be tested. In the heart of West Africa, where the Niger River weaved through savanna and desert, rose one of the wealthiest empires the world had ever seen, Mali. Founded by the legendary Sundiata Keita in the 13th century, Mali was more than a kingdom. It was a gold-drenched civilization whose influence extended from the rainforests of Guinea to the trading ports of North Africa. Its cities, especially Timbuktu, became symbols of learning, spirituality, and immeasurable prosperity. At the center of this empire stood one man who would shake the foundations of the world economy, Mansa Musa. Mansa Musa's 1324 pilgrimage to Mecca wasn't just a spiritual obligation, it was a global flex. Accompanied by an entourage of 60,000 men and camels carrying hundreds of pounds of gold, Musa passed through Egypt and Arabia, distributing wealth so lavishly that it crashed economies and deflated gold's value for a decade. Cairo, Mecca, and Medina were left awestruck, and European cartographers, who barely acknowledged Africa before, now placed Mali at the center of their maps, labeling it with a black king holding a golden nugget. Musa's hajj wasn't just historical, it was mythical, a statement that Africa wasn't on the periphery of civilization, it was civilization itself. Yet Mali's greatness wasn't measured only in gold. It was a beacon of intellectual enlightenment. Timbuktu became home to the Sankore University, where scholars debated astronomy, medicine, law, and philosophy long before the Renaissance took root in Europe. Thousands of handwritten manuscripts, many still preserved, stand as living proof of Africa's ancient academic might. Laws were codified through Islamic and traditional systems. Trade routes became knowledge routes, and merchants turned into diplomats, uniting disparate cultures under a singular imperial vision. Beneath this sophistication lay deep cultural traditions. The griot, oral historians and musicians, carried the empire's legacy in epic chants and stories. Their words were libraries, their memory, sacred. The Mali Empire wasn't just a state, it was a cultural ecosystem where ancestral honor, religious faith, and economic ambition danced in unison. Unlike colonial regimes that extracted and destroyed, Mali built temples, schools, palaces, and markets that hummed with life and learning. But as with all empires, the weight of its own glory would become its burden. Internal rivalries, succession crises, and external invasions slowly chipped at Mali's foundations. Still, the echoes of its greatness ring out. Mansa Musa remains the richest human in recorded history, and the cultural blueprints Mali laid, of spiritual power, intellectual ambition, and wealth with purpose, remain timeless. This wasn't just Africa's golden age, it was humanity's. Rising from the dense tropical forests of West Africa, the Kingdom of Benin was a marvel of precision, artistry, and political genius. Located in present-day Nigeria, Benin was no mere tribal society, it was a meticulously engineered state, famed for its earthworks, bronze craftsmanship, and deeply spiritual monarchy. Its capital, Benin City, boasted vast streets, palaces, and an urban plan that stunned early European visitors. Dutch explorers in the 1600s compared it to Amsterdam in grandeur. But what truly made Benin extraordinary were the massive walls, a network of fortifications stretching over 16,000 kilometers, longer than the Great Wall of China. These were not just defenses, they were monuments of civil organization and sacred power. At the heart of the kingdom stood the Oba, a divine king who served not only as political leader but as the spiritual anchor of the realm. The Oba was believed to be the intermediary between the living and the ancestors, possessing powers imbued by Olakan, the god of wealth and the sea. Every royal act, from war declarations to festivals, was embedded in ritual. The annual Igu festival, for instance, was more than celebration, it was a sacred rite of renewal, blessing the Oba and reaffirming his cosmic role. Tradition held that the Oba was not merely chosen but born of divine essence, making rebellion not just treasonous, but spiritually catastrophic. Benin's artistic expression immortalized this divine authority. The famed Benin bronzes, cast in sophisticated lost wax techniques, depicted scenes of royal court life, spiritual rituals, and military triumphs. These were not mere ornaments, they were historical records, coded with symbolism, lineage, and ancestral memory. Crafted in guilds passed down for generations, each plaque was a spell of history, a visual scripture of Benin's grandeur. Today, many of these masterpieces reside in European museums, plundered during the 1897 British invasion, standing as both trophies of conquest and haunting reminders of cultural theft. Benin's legacy also lies in its socio-political complexity. It had a dual-chambered government, with checks and balances between the Oba and a council of chiefs known as the Uzama. This prevented tyranny and ensured that tradition governed ambition. Its military was feared, its diplomacy respected, and its trading network vast, reaching as far as Portugal, with whom Benin established contact as early as the 15th century. But even in international dealings, Benin maintained its cultural core, refusing to sell its people into slavery, demanding fair trade, and safeguarding its spiritual sanctity. Yet, as foreign interests grew darker and greedier, Benin's defiance became a threat. The 1897 British punitive expedition devastated the kingdom, burning its palaces, exiling its Oba, and looting its sacred treasures. But Benin did not vanish, it transformed. Its traditions, bronzes, and oral legacies still breathe through the Edo people today. Its walls may have been breached, but its spirit remains unbroken, a thunderous reminder that Africa's greatness was never silenced, only silenced. Deep in the southeastern hills of present-day Zimbabwe, a majestic stone city rises from the earth, Great Zimbabwe, a symbol of African ingenuity, architectural mastery, and sacred kingship. Built entirely without mortar, its massive stone walls, some reaching over 30 feet high, curve with mathematical precision. The city once housed over 18,000 people and served as the capital of the Kingdom of Zimbabwe, a Shona civilization that flourished between the 11th and 15th centuries. But Great Zimbabwe was more than stone, it was spirit, the physical embodiment of divine kingship and ancestral connection to the land. At the center of this civilization was the Mambo, or king, whose authority was tied directly to the gods and the ancestors. Unlike pyramids or towering palaces built for grandeur, the architecture of Great Zimbabwe expressed sacred geometry and symbolism. The great enclosure, with its conical tower, is thought to have represented fertility, continuity, and cosmic balance. The city's layout itself mirrored spiritual cosmology, with royal compounds, ritual centers, and sacred hills all woven into a divine blueprint. Here, power was spatial, and stone was not just building material, it was a language of eternity. Great Zimbabwe controlled the flow of gold, ivory, and cattle, connecting the African interior to the Swahili coast and beyond to India and China. Archaeological findings, including glass beads from Asia, Arab coins, and Chinese porcelain, prove that this stone kingdom was part of a global trade network long before colonial contact. Yet, in spite of such evidence, European colonialists and early archaeologists refused to believe that black Africans could have built such splendor. They concocted theories of lost white civilizations or biblical connections, anything but the truth. This was African genius, pure and undeniable. Culturally, the Shona people wove deep spiritual traditions into their daily lives. Rituals were conducted to honor Mondoro spirits, ancestral guardian lions believed to inhabit sacred forests and hills. Spirit mediums and diviners played key roles in governance, war decisions, and agricultural cycles. Rainmaking ceremonies were critical, linking the ruler's legitimacy to his ability to ensure natural harmony. Even today, among the Shona, the ruins of Great Zimbabwe are not just historical, they are alive, sacred ground whispered about in prayer, myth, and memory. Great Zimbabwe eventually declined, likely due to environmental degradation, overpopulation, and shifts in trade routes. But its legacy remains unshakable. It gifted its name to a modern nation and its stone birds became national symbols. The city stands today as an eternal rebuttal to the lies of colonial erasure, declaring in granite and dust, Africa built civilizations as sacred, sophisticated, and powerful as any on earth. If Mali built the stage, then Songhai delivered the performance that crowned West Africa as a world power. By the 15th century, as Mali's influence waned, the Songhai Empire surged to dominance, becoming the largest empire in African history. Stretching from the Atlantic coast deep into the heart of Niger and Nigeria, Songhai controlled vital trans-Saharan trade routes and cities like Gao, Jen, and the crown jewel, Timbuktu. But what set Songhai apart was not just its military might or territorial reach, it was its devotion to knowledge, governance, and spiritual balance. Under the legendary rule of Askia Muhammad I, Songhai became a paragon of Islamic administration fused with traditional African values. Askia reorganized the empire into provinces, appointed governors, instituted tax systems, and established a legal code rooted in both Sharia law and customary practices. He even journeyed to Mecca, forging diplomatic and religious alliances that strengthened Songhai's global presence. Yet, he never erased his cultural roots. Instead, he harmonized Islamic faith with local traditions, allowing for a blended identity that preserved ancestral wisdom. Timbuktu, long mythologized in the Western imagination, wasn't a fantasy, it was a real intellectual lighthouse. The Sankore University attracted scholars from North Africa, the Middle East, and beyond. Thousands of manuscripts, on subjects ranging from astronomy and law to botany and mathematics, were copied, studied, and preserved here. Students memorized the Quran, debated philosophy, and exchanged ideas in Arabic and local languages. At its peak, Timbuktu rivaled any European university of the time. Songhai proved that African minds didn't just follow global knowledge, they led it. Despite this enlightenment, the empire was not without its cultural guardians. Griots maintained oral epics, spirit mediums advised rulers, and indigenous religious festivals coexisted with Islamic observances. This dynamic tension between tradition and imported religion created a cultural synergy, not a conflict. Unlike colonial frameworks that sought to erase and replace, Songhai integrated and elevated. Here, wisdom was plural, and knowledge, both spiritual and empirical, was considered divine. But greatness often draws envy. In 1591, Moroccan forces armed with European firearms invaded Songhai, defeating its cavalry and scattering its institutions. Timbuktu was plundered, libraries destroyed, and scholars exiled. Yet Songhai's intellectual DNA had already been imprinted on African consciousness. Its manuscripts still whisper from dusty libraries. Its scholars' ideas live on in oral traditions. The fall of Songhai was not the end of African intellect, it was the beginning of its buried resistance. What was lost in empire was preserved in memory, waiting to rise again. No empire falls overnight. The demise of Africa's golden civilizations wasn't due to incompetence or stagnation, it was the result of calculated betrayals, insatiable greed, and the violent recalibration of global power. As European explorers transformed into invaders and traders into colonizers, Africa's complex kingdoms became battlegrounds for exploitation. The Portuguese crept in with flattery and gifts, the British arrived cloaked in treaties and trade deals, the French, the Dutch, and the Belgians all followed with cunning. What began as diplomacy spiraled into a maelstrom of manipulation, where African rulers were forced to choose between resistance, submission, or strategic betrayal. Many African leaders sought to engage with Europe on equal terms. They offered gold, ivory, art, and even education exchanges. But Europeans saw not partners, they saw resources and real estate. Through treaties laced with deceit and translated to mislead, European powers claimed land they did not own and forced allegiance through manufactured wars. In the Kingdom of Congo, for example, King Afonso I tried to limit the slave trade and protect his sovereignty by writing directly to the Portuguese crown. His pleas were ignored. His kingdom was bled dry of its people and dignity. Slavery, weaponized by colonial economies, became the axis of destruction. While slavery had existed in Africa in more domestic and social forms, the Atlantic slave trade industrialized human suffering. European traders turned local rivalries into permanent warfare, arming factions and fueling decades of chaos. Villages were razed, sacred traditions abandoned, and societies destabilized in exchange for guns, rum, and trinkets. The very intellectual and spiritual leaders who had once governed empires were now either enslaved or executed. The fabric of African civilization was not just frayed, it was deliberately unraveled. Europe's second weapon was colonial ideology, the myth that Africa had no history, no governance, and no soul. This lie was backed by brutal force. The British sacked Benin and exiled the Oba. The French dismantled the Mali remnants and imposed their language, schools, and legal systems. The Germans scorched the kingdoms of the Herero and Nama. What wasn't destroyed was rewritten. Africa's past was buried beneath rubble, missionary schools, and museum walls in Europe. The wisdom of ancestors was branded pagan, and the children of empire were taught to forget their greatness. Yet, even as cities were burned and dynasties erased, something powerful survived: memory. Stories told in hushed tones around village fires. Songs hidden within masquerade rituals. Ancient manuscripts tucked beneath mosque floors. The European disruption shattered the bodies of African empires, but could not extinguish their spirit. That spirit would smolder underground, waiting for its moment to rise. The final act was not destruction, it was displacement, and from that displacement, a call to remembrance would roar back. Though swords fell and palaces crumbled, Africa's ancient empires never truly died, they transformed. The spirit of Mali, Songhai, Benin, Kush, and Great Zimbabwe lives on in the oral traditions, ritual practices, and ancestral wisdom still whispered across the continent. The griots still chant lineages of kings long buried, the Yoruba still invoke Orunmila for wisdom, and the sacred drums still beat in rhythm with stories older than borders. These empires left behind more than ruins, they bequeathed systems of thought, codes of morality, and spiritual blueprints that continue to shape African identity and resistance in the modern era. From the intricate justice systems of the Ashanti to the consensus-driven democracies of the Igbo, African political thought pioneered ideas of balance, accountability, and sacred leadership. The apprenticeship systems of the Yoruba, the guilds of Benin, and the communal economics of the Zulu were not primitive. They were sustainable, intergenerational models of wealth transfer and social stability. These legacies are not obsolete, they are radical blueprints for reimagining governance, economics, and community in a fractured world. Culturally, the artistic legacies are undeniable. Benin bronzes, Nok terracottas, and Kemet's temples are now celebrated in global institutions, though often acquired through theft. Beyond artifacts, African spirituality, once demonized, is now revered worldwide. Practices rooted in Vodun, Ifa, and ancient cosmologies have migrated to Brazil, Haiti, Cuba, and the American South, morphing into global spiritual movements. Even modern music, dance, and fashion bear the fingerprints of ancient empires, pulsing with rhythms that trace back to ritual and royal courts. In education, the manuscripts of Timbuktu are now being digitized and preserved, reclaiming Africa's rightful place in the intellectual history of the world. Scholars, artists, and leaders across the diaspora are unearthing and retelling these stories with fierce urgency, challenging colonial lies and reigniting pride. Movements like Afrofuturism, Pan-Africanism, and cultural reclamation are not merely aesthetic, they are political and spiritual acts of resurrection. Africa is not just looking back, it is reawakening, reimagining, and rewriting its future based on ancestral genius. So when we say the African empires fell, we must remember, they didn't vanish, they became seeds. Seeds buried beneath centuries of sand, blood, and silence, now cracking open beneath the weight of truth. The gods have not forgotten. The ancestors have not left. The wisdom remains. And from that sacred soil, Africa rises again, not as a victim of history, but as a vision for humanity's future. The story of Africa's empires is not just a tale of ancient grandeur, it is a mirror of who we were, who we are, and who we can become. From the sacred stone walls of Great Zimbabwe to the golden thrones of Mali, from the divine bronzes of Benin to the intellectual libraries of Songhai, Africa once stood as a cradle of wisdom, wealth, and world-shaping power. Though colonialism tried to bury this legacy, it still breathes in our traditions, our languages, our spirit. The time has come to rewrite the narrative, to reclaim the truth, and to honor the ancestors who shaped civilizations with divine brilliance. If this journey awakens something in you, don't let it stop here. Like, comment, share, and subscribe to join us as we continue to uncover the hidden truths of Africa's past, present, and unstoppable future.